morning, my friends. It's a chilly but beautifully sunny morning. Bit of a paradox here. Anyway, I hope you're all keeping well. I want to talk about the fact that you cannot trust Irish mythology, or you can't trust Norse mythology. And those of you of a folkish or a vokish inclination who are applying a spiritual or even a cultural should we say worldview or lifestyle towards these stories under the assumption that they are correct repositories of the ancient Celtic or ancient Irish or ancient Norse tradition, you're making a big mistake, and I'll tell you why. These stories were written down by Christian monks, both the Irish ones and the Norse ones, with a heavy editorialization. Now, prior to that, in both cultures, we would have had a predominantly oral tradition that would have preserved the stories intact. Therefore, to actually say, oh, I'm living by the Icelandic sagas, or I'm applying my spirituality towards the Irish mythological cycle and so on, is completely incorrect. Well, not completely. Some of it, and maybe a lot of it, could be true. But remember, it was Christian monks and Christians who wrote down both with a brief in order to make it as Christianized as possible, so as to seamlessly integrate the Christian parables in towards the prevailing local folklore. It was simply based on the idea of conquest. Now, the Roman idea of conquest is not like just conquering a land. It's utter annihilation of their spiritual traditions, their culture, everything. And utter annihilation to the point where they are replaced by a Roman culture. Now, the best example of this, or most tragic example of this, would be the Carthaginians. They were completely conquered by the Romans, although you could make the argument that the conquistadors of Spain probably did the same with the Aztecs in Central America, although that's debatable. Now, you look at the Irish mythological cycle, you see parallels with Christianity. Are they real? Are they not? Are they archetypal stories, or are they deliberate Christian editorializations? We must tread carefully. The death of Cuchulainn mirrors in many ways the death of Christ. Not only the fact that he's basically crucified against the standing stone, and that's very seamlessly, the monk would have said, and then when Cuchulainn was crucified by the standing stone and died, and the Morrigan landed on his shoulder, then the Christian monk would turn to the locals and say, the children, remember, the adults were not children, they didn't need to be spoken down to like children, they were probably more intelligent than the Christians who arrived, and would have said things like, there was also another God called Jesus, and he was crucified not against a standing stone but against a cross, although that's an interesting facet we can dwell on, also the actual history of Christianity and when the cross came in. But and there's other aspects too, like the Fomorians were portrayed as giants. And you even see the story of how Nuada of the Silver Arm slays Balor of the Evil Eye, the giant. There's definitely a parallel there with David and Goliath. Again, is that real? Was that editorialized? We can see that also in the Norse saga. Are the ice giants Goliath? We must always be careful. Those of you of a folkish tint, you've got to always be careful. You can't just say there like, I'm dressed in folkish clothes and I know it all because I follow the sagas. You're still being played into a Christian psyop. Another one that's important too is the idea that what we can tell is probably true. If you look at the overall Indo-European tradition, we can see things that, if you look at my book Sorcery, the Invocation of Strangeness, I describe that quite possibly we can put our money on both Lu and Loki as being the root of the Indo-European word Luke, which means a flash of light. And that's also, Thor, the Lord God of Thunder, follows Loki, the lightning, and Lu, and therefore we have that is probably true. We can also make cross-pollination things with the likes of Indra and so on in the Vedic tradition. Always question. Now, there is another one that we can probably put our money on, as I wrote in the Druid Code in 1699. The Welsh antiquarian Lund went to open Newgrange, believing it was built by the Scandinavians, until a local farmer, I think called Cormac O'Neill, informed them about it was related to the god Angus Og and the Elkmar, and basically the mythology of the Boyne Valley, which was almost unknown then in a written tradition until these books appeared and were properly translated maybe 100 or so years later. And it did indeed line up with the oral tradition passed down by farmers in County Meath. See, this is important. The oral tradition is the good one, but sadly there's not enough of it. But we do have a lot of it, and things like there's certainly Irish archetypes like the Cailleach Beara was predominantly held within the oral tradition, and so was Breed was predominantly held within the oral tradition outside the confines of Christian scribes and Christian monks. See, this is where the British Israelites were digging up Tara looking for the Ark of the Covenant because of nonsense like the idea that Scotia's grave is down in Kerry, an Egyptian princess. I mean, this is dangerous stuff. I'm even seeing people who should know better within this sort of like antiquarian, archaeological, mythological scene, still promoting this nonsense. It's not good. That's not good. It should be immediately shut down instead of entertained for the sake of some kind of multicultural idea. The fact is, Scotia's grave is not Scotia's grave. It's a megalith of ancient ancestors. The same thing with these people who apply Irish folklore on top of megaliths. The megaliths are thousands of years older than the Druids and the Celts. We don't know who built them. Genetically, we know it's the people who live in Sardinia and parts of Western Iberia, and the Irish have quite a lot of that Sardinian DNA as well, but mostly it's been washed out. And therefore, we start to look at things like Sardinian folklore, Sardinian mythology. That's why I, spend a lot of my mind and thinking and going to Sardinia to try and unleash that. You cannot localize this form of study. You just can't. It's just because of the Christian thing. Because the Christians were conquesting our mythology in just the same way the Roman legions were conquesting our other cultures like the Britons and so on. Another thing with the Romans is the Fomorians. If you look at my book, the Mysterious Round Towers of Ireland, I put forward the theory, and it's not my theory, it's actually a few other people who come up with this as well, that the possibility that the Fomorians were actually the Romans, seafaring tax collectors from Britain. Think about it. And that they were pagan Romans. And we do know that the Roman historians such as Agricola mentioned that Ireland was well known to the Romans in pagan times. So this idea that we were isolated until St. Patrick's came is pure nonsense. And the same with the Norse tales. You will see there's all kinds of parallels with what was Odin really suspended upside down and hung like an inverted Jesus or St. Peter? We've got to be careful. We've got to be always very, very careful in looking at the indigenous, try to get back to the indigenous European, the ones who really built the megaliths, and see what their culture was. Unfortunately, it was a lot of it was lost except for the oral tradition. It's finding that oral tradition. I would describe it as an onion, okay? And on the first layer of the onion is what we have today of the Irish, the Celtic and the Norse mythological tradition. The real truth is in the middle, and we have to peel back the layers using comparative analysis, cross-pollinated from other traditions, and as much as the oral tradition that we can actually identify and use to get to the truth at the middle. Now, a good way I'm finding, and I haven't done any publicity on it, but it is a work in progress, is going to Sardinia and going to Route 1 to see if I can find something at the core of this that we can play back. And that's sort of like, it'll be kind of like eventually the Druid Code Part 2, although it will have a different title. We always must be careful about who takes over our folk and our mythological traditions. The folkish revival of Victorian Europe in the late 1800s, the Wandervogel groups and so on, was started in a great place, but it was corrupted by anti-Semitic Nazis who eventually came along and re-engineered it, washed out the Germanic paganism and brought in Roman classical pagan, Greek classical paganism. I'm big fan of Roman and Greek classical paganism, so I'm not putting that down, but it was not indigenous to the Germanic pagan tradition. So that's why you had likes of Albert Speer designing statues of Greek and Roman gods like Mercury to put around the streets of this new Berlin they were building. They were building a new Athens, really, or a new Rome, or a new Constantinople. They weren't building a real capital for Germany. Again, the Folkish movement that may have started off in the 1800s, and there's definitely a lot of things to suggest it was an excellent counterpoint to industrialization. It was ultimately corrupted by political forces who used it to antagonize against certain other groups in order to maintain control and put political power in it. That's why I will never be a right winger. I'll definitely never be a left winger. I'll always be an anarchist in the middle, looking, observing, and looking for potentials and elements of chaos, rather than being led by the forces of political mandate. So those of you who are going to megaliths and thinking it's got to do with greed, or got to do with Loki, or got to do with Satanta or Finn McCool, maybe it does on some archetypal level, but you cannot venerate Celtic gods at Irish megalithic sites, and you certainly can't venerate Egyptian ones or biblical ones, which is what's unfortunately is still going on indirectly. The Christian mind virus is so incredibly strong that even people who should know better are still falling into that trap, even after all these years and after all these warnings. Look to the comparative analysis with Indo-European folk traditions and mythology. Look towards the remains of the oral tradition and find conduits and paths from that to the center of the onion. We may never get there, but to sit on the outside of the onion being good Christians while we're thinking we're like pagan revivalists is not good. Thank you.